Thank you, everybody. There are still days where I hear those numbers and think,
I'll come back.
Does anyone think it's a good idea that I'm in charge? It's a different problem. So I'm going to talk about a few different things. Actually, this afternoon's talk was a great introduction. Sarah gave you a perspective from the private sector, what's possible in energy and climate tech, where the big ideas may lie and where there are needs for us to lean forward. I'm going to bring the public sector perspective. And over the last decade, I've gotten to spend a lot of time with my colleagues in industry who are doing amazing work in many fields. And I really do think at the intersection is where the solution to many of these problems lie. So what's the difference between the public sector and the private sector in this case? So the DOE National Labs are large, multidisciplinary organizations. There are 17 of us. We typically have big facilities and capabilities that would be difficult to steward, particularly in a small or mid-sized company, large computers, large experimental facilities. We're supported by the government, so we have a long time scale associated with the research we do. So we can take on really hard things that are not ready for commercialization, and I'll talk about a couple of those in my talk today. What we're not good at today is speed. And so for me, this marriage of the ambition and energy, pardon the pun, and speed at which the private sector is moving, coupled with the might of some of these public sector institutions, is a real opportunity for us as a country to move out on these problems. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my lab, just as, well, I think I'm legally obligated to tell you a little bit about my lab, to give you a little bit of a grounding in who we are and what we do. You know, there are 17 DOE labs. They're all quite different, one from another. So my lab is part of the National Nuclear Security Administration. We have responsibilities for the nation's nuclear stockpile, along with Los Alamos. And I understand Director Tom Mason will be here tomorrow. He can give you his perspective since he's not here. Livermore's the best. As Shanna said, we're about 9,000. Los Alamos has about 18,000 employees, and Sandia, which is the engineering lab in the trio, has about 16,000 employees. So we are officially the little lab that could. And we have a particular focus on scientific capabilities, high performance computing, high energy density science, advanced materials and manufacturing, and a whole host of others. So I'm going to start with a short video that we created to introduce people to who we are and what we do.
It always starts with two words. What if? It's the question that brought us all here. What if we could ensure that the nuclear weapons in our stockpile are safe, secure, and effective without setting one off? We do that. What if we had a computer capable of more than 2 quintillion calculations? Yeah, that's a real number, in the time it takes to say 1 Mississippi. We have that. What if we could create a machine that builds specialized materials in different shapes? We built that. What if we could harness fusion, the process that drives the sun, in a lab setting to support national security and take important steps toward a clean energy future? We can, and we did. At Lawrence Livermore, we turn big ideas into reality. We protect our nation. We make the world a better place. We believe curiosity spurs innovation, and innovation turns into impact. In fact, our research on powerful lasers helped enable the newest tiny chips that let you watch this on a handheld device. Color-coding human DNA so we can identify mutations causing diseases like cancer. Combining AI with some of the most powerful supercomputers to find new therapeutics. Creating a first-of-its-kind climate research center to better understand the world around us so future generations can, too. When faced with the world's most complex problems, our diverse teams and partnerships make the impossible possible. And for us, impossible is just the beginning. We shape the future by anticipating new challenges. Because our what-ifs lead to what's next. So we had a lot of fun with that. Our videographer is actually the voice
for the overlay. So he's now officially the voice of God at the laboratory. So if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, you saw in the back, well, first of all, the hero of Oppenheimer is Lawrence, because Lawrence had the wrench and we needed to build something. So that was very important. The person you might have seen in the background was Edward Teller, of course, who has a long history and connection to the Hertz Foundation, who wanted to move on to new technologies. So Lawrence and Teller came to Livermore to found our laboratory, quite literally to be the counterculture to Los Alamos. In this highly classified realm, it's critically important to have peer review, and so having a second lab was a big part of that. So we were established in 1952. We're quite different in many ways. Our culture is quite different, but our site is very different. So we said on our main site is 1 square mile in the East Bay, about 45 minutes east of San Francisco, with the preponderance of our 9,000 employees in that space. So that really fosters a culture of collaboration and multidisciplinary big team science. We already talked about the budget. We've been on a very steep growth trajectory. So we've grown by about 3,000 employees over the last 6 or 7 years. If you look at our demographics today, 50% of my employees have less than 5 years experience at the lab. 75% have less than 10. So I tried to figure out why everyone at the lab was retiring, or it felt like that. And I saw there are only 300 people in my experience cohort at the lab. So I literally know every single person who's of retirement age at the laboratory. So really exciting time, lots of new people, new ideas, really important challenges in national security, but an interesting moment to bring along a new generation to steward these important problems. So if you zoom out and you look at our lab from 100,000 feet, we're a national security lab with a nuclear core. So as I said, our core mission is to steward the nation's nuclear deterrent. We're responsible for the systems that we put into the stockpile. So primarily those are Air Force systems today, the warheads that fly on the ICBMs and on the bombers. Through a historical accident, we actually created the technology that miniaturized nuclear weapons so they could go on submarines, and now we're the Air Force lab. So nuclear deterrence by budget is about 2/3 of our lab, but that includes the science and technology underpinnings that enable that mission. You saw in the video the new big computer we're citing, El Capitan. That'll be the first exascale computer for national security applications. It'll be about twice as big as the Frontier machine at Oak Ridge today. So we're currently building it out. It'll come online by the end of the calendar year. That machine will have 30,000 GPUs. So it's great for the kind of modeling and simulation we do, but it's also great for thinking about things like AI. We work across a wide range of threat preparedness and response missions, nuclear, chemical, bio, radiological, explosive, very significant programs in biology, biosecurity, bioresilience, in particular using both our engineering prowess to create engineered platforms to study biology and our computing to really model biological systems at scale. Long legacy in climate and energy security, and climate and energy are both national security problems today. If you watch what happened in Ukraine and the actions that were undertaken early in that conflict against the energy system in Ukraine, you understand this, energy security, energy sovereignty is not an academic issue. This is really an important problem that many countries are facing. And Livermore has been in the climate business for a very long time. The very first global circulation models were actually created at our lab in the 1950s. But today we're trying to understand how to use that information to make meaningful decisions about how we have to change the way we live, how we can adapt and mitigate the worst impacts of a changing climate. And then finally, multi-domain deterrence is everything else. Space, cyber, conventional munitions, directed energy, electronic warfare, all of the other technology domains you can imagine, all built on an underpinning of very fundamental science and technology research. So most of the research we do at the lab is open and done in the international scientific community with partners in academia and industry to really ensure that we stay at the forefront. And then we bring those tools, those capabilities, those people into our national security missions. So you'll hear a different perspective from me. I've been in this business for a very long time. I tend to see things through somewhat dark glass. So we tend to look at technology both for the benefits and the incredible opportunity it presents, but also try to understand the other uses that it could be turned to. And so there are many things happening today that really have that character. As part of our national security mission, we've created this really unique set of capabilities, in particular around fusion. So Livermore is home to the National Ignition Facility, the world's largest, most energetic laser, where, as you saw in the video, for the first time in history, by any technique, we created a net positive energy gain fusion experiment in the laboratory. So this is a big deal for the fusion community. So we do this for national security applications, but there's an incredible potential to build on this as a platform toward fusion energy for the future. We talked about climate science, where we're now running some of the most highly resolved climate models in the world, building on the Energy Exascale Earth Systems Model, E3SM, which is the DOE's big climate model, and increasingly relying on tools like AI. Now, we've been working with AI, machine learning, data science tools for a very long time, but the recent emergence of large language models has spurred an accelerated pace in this area. So what's unique about this moment in time for everything we're talking about today? And that's the pace of change. You know, technology tends to speed up over time, but when you look at how quickly technologies like generative AI can be taken up by large populations, how quickly they can have impact at scale across many disciplines, it's unlike anything we've seen before. So I love this chart. This was an executive at Samsung showed this. Of course, the world's population changes a lot over that time, but the basic message remains the same. You know, the pace of progress is very fast, and the advantage we will have in the future is our ability to move at that speed. So if we can out-innovate and outthink, we can stay ahead. So I'm going to show you one more video. This one is about the first disruptive technology I'm going to discuss, which is fusion. Pardon the dramatic music. So this is the video of the National Ignition Facility. So this is where we do this fusion work. As I said, it's the world's largest, most energetic laser, 3 football fields in extent, 10 stories tall facility. The laser starts with a single laser pulse, very low energy in the basement of the building. We take energy off the grid and charge up capacitor banks to energize the laser. That initial laser pulse is then split many ways, 192 ways, and begins to propagate through the facility, gaining energy as it moves through those laser amplifiers. So most of the facility is a giant laser amplifier. And actually, you can see the size of the beams. They start very small, like a tiny pinprick. At the end of this, they'll be about a foot square. So that's how we manage that level of energy density. So from a very small fraction of a joule of laser energy, it will get amplified in each beam line up to several thousand joules. And we can deliver a total of more than 2 megajoules of laser energy in the ultraviolet to the target. So those 192 laser beams then get split. 96 go up, 96 go down. They get focused into the target chamber, converted to blue light, and then they converge in a target, and this is really the trick. So this is a very small gold can, about this big, and that energy density is what makes this work. So the lasers are converted to X-rays. They burn off the outside of a capsule currently made out of diamond that's filled with deuterium and tritium, hydrogen fuel. The outside of the capsule blows off. That pushes the interior of the surface inward, and that convergence is what starts the fusion process. So if you can push the fuel together fast enough, get it to high enough density and temperature, and hold it together long enough, that burn will begin to propagate out through the fusion fuel. And you can generate more energy than you put in, which sounds very simple. We knew the basic physics of fusion a long time ago. It only took 60 years. We worked super hard. So it is quite simple conceptually. What's really difficult is the marriage not just of physics, but physics and engineering. So those targets are some of the most precise engineered objects man has ever created. So those targets, those little capsules need to be perfect. The features on them are smaller, well smaller, order of magnitude smaller than the size of a human hair. So each of those diamond capsules takes about 7 months to produce from start to finish because of the perfection requirements. They then have to be suspended in the middle of that can by tiny wires. A 2-micron fill tube is attached to the target to put the fuel into the capsule. And then the laser energy has to be delivered extremely precisely so that you push evenly on all sides of the capsule. So this idea of taking a big idea like fusion and making it reality takes an army of people. So when we published the first paper on ignition, the first achievement of ignition in the laboratory, we had well more than 1,000 authors. And that's decades of work, technicians, material scientists, engineers, physicists, chemists, all those disciplines were critically important to making that successful. So what have we done since we achieved ignition at NIF? Well, we've done it again and again and again. So we have had 4 more shots that have exceeded the ignition threshold. The most successful one achieving a gain of greater than 2, which is really astounding when you think of where we started on this journey. Now, what does that mean for fusion energy? Well, the plausibility argument part is done. We've demonstrated that it's possible in a laboratory setting with a driver like a laser to achieve these conditions. But we're very, very far from wall plug energy break even. So I sort of glossed over, we charge up those capacitors at the beginning of this process. We take 330 million joules off the grid to charge the capacitors to produce 2 megajoules of laser energy. So net energy gain in the experiment is not very close to wall plug break even. Each of those laser beams, as it propagates, becomes incredibly powerful, but the way we do that, again, is time. We take a huge amount of energy and we compress it into a very small amount of time. So at the moment that that laser is entering the target chamber, we're producing many times more than the entire generating capacity of the US grid, but just for a billionth of a second. So there are a huge range of challenges to take fusion energy from a great concept to reality. Now, there are other approaches. Most of the investment in the private sector is in magnetic fusion, so using objects like tokamaks. So tokamak's a big torus, big donut, surrounded by magnets, where inertial confinement fusion is very small and fast and pulsed. Magnetic fusion is low and slow. So you put a large plasma in this large vessel, and you hold it and squeeze it with magnetic fields and maintain it in that compressed state for a long period of time. So in both cases, there are a series of challenges that need to be overcome in order for this to be a viable energy source. There need to be materials that can survive high radiation environments. There need to be ways to convert the neutrons that are produced in the fusion process to heat, so they can be converted to electrons to go onto the grid. We need to be able to breed tritium in the reactor because you need fuel to make this go. And so the way we make tritium today is in nuclear fission reactors. We need a self-generating system, and it turns out a lot of that physics and engineering is not yet done. So the next few years will be pretty important, and the opportunity is immense. So what does it mean to the world if you create an energy source that is clean, generates some low-level waste, but nothing like nuclear fission does, abundant, baseload generating at scale, potentially cheap? Hydrogen comes from water, so the fuel is abundantly available. And if the system is engineered properly, it'll make the radioactive component, the tritium, can be deployed anywhere. It doesn't have many of the same safety and proliferation considerations that fission does. Now, there are still considerations to be considered, but it has different attributes. So what does it mean if you can change the energy system in that kind of dramatic way? Not just deploy a new type of energy, but deploy a type of energy that really changes everything about supply and demand in the world. So I'm going to pose questions. I'm going to talk about a bunch of different things. I'm going to pose this question at the end. And then at my last slide, we have all the questions summarized. And then we can have you can all tell me what the geostrategic implications are of unlimited clean energy. So we're working, although our mission is national security, since we have the only experimental facility on the planet that can achieve these conditions, we're working with the companies that are forming around this technology and with academic and other partners to really drive it forward. I mean, we have an obligation to enable this potential fusion energy future. And the Department of Energy has started investing in this technology. On the good news front, for a long time, the budget for inertial fusion energy was identically zero in the Department of Energy. So we've seen an infinite increase in our budget. It's still pretty small. So the budget to us in inertial fusion energy is in the order of $10 million a year. If we really want to be serious about fusion energy, this isn't a tens or hundreds of millions of dollar question. This is $1 billion a year for a decade or 2 decades to really drive these technologies over the finish line. Again, in partnership with private sector investments so that we can solve the problems that need our facilities and capabilities, and we can use the speed and agility of the private sector to create a power plant. So this was also teased in the video. This is an example from our E3SM simulations of the climate. And one of the challenges we've always had in climate modeling is that while we're very good at predicting weather, which is local, and you can do it very high fidelity, global climate systems are very complicated and they're very big. So you need compute at very significant scale before you can begin to resolve at a level that allows you to understand even significant topography of the Earth, like mountains and small bodies of water, all of things that can impact the climate system, but which were beyond reach with prior model sets. So now with modern compute, with modern technologies, with sub-grid scale modeling techniques, we're able to do things like understand the detailed currents that are bringing atmospheric rivers to California. So that's the takeaway from this are those series of storms pummeling California, dropping like our year's rainfall in 2 days, 6 times in a row across the winter. And so what does this model mean, right? We've been doing climate modeling for a very long time. We understand the climate system with significant uncertainties pretty well. How can we use these tools to understand what's coming in a meaningful way? So how do we prepare communities, countries, for the changes that are happening today and that we anticipate over the next decades? How do we decide which climate mitigation strategies to pursue? And how quickly do they need to be deployed at scale? So this is, for me, a really exciting transformation of what was a somewhat academic exercise, understanding the climate, into a real tool for decision makers to help us shape the policies and the investments we make over the next decade to ensure we have the best chance of making it through this next era, which will be pretty tricky. So we also talked this morning about carbon removal, and the point was made that even if we stopped emissions today, we still have a terrible problem. There's a huge amount of accumulated carbon in the environment, and in order to really get to the point where we can turn around the changes that we're seeing today, we need to be able to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Most of them are not economically very viable today. So direct air capture, as an example, at scale, would be very difficult to ask industry to take up because of the cost. So we did a study funded by philanthropy, by our Livermore Lab Foundation and the ClimateWorks Foundation, to look at the state of California. So California has long been a leader in this arena, and the state wanted to understand, with today's technology, what are the prospects we could achieve our carbon neutrality goals over the next 2 decades? So our team did a study looking at all of the potential pathways for storing carbon. So looking at agricultural pathways, talked about that this morning, using deep-rooted plants to store more carbon in the soil, or microbial techniques to enhance the carbon uptake of plants, converting biomass and recycling carbon into other useful chemicals, geologic storage. We have a long history at our lab of exquisite understanding of subsurface science, again, drawing on our nuclear legacy that comes from doing nuclear testing. And we've participated in many carbon capture and storage pilots, but none of them have been done in the US at scale. So what role could that play? And then how can we do the right type of land utilization to take best advantage of the land mass that we have? So the report for California, which is called Getting to Neutral, was very optimistic, actually. With today's technology, if deployed at scale, you could achieve California's carbon neutrality goals. So that caught the attention of the Department of Energy, who said, well, what about for the whole US? Well, the energy system's complicated. It's exquisitely local, and most of these strategies don't work at a nation scale level. You really do have to tailor them to the local economy, to the local geology, to the local population density. So a multi-lab team led by our researchers took a look at a county by county level at removing enough carbon to achieve the nation's carbon neutrality goals in this Roads to Removal report, which was just rolled out last fall. So what you see here is a map that highlights what some of the strategies are that might be most applicable to different regions of the country. And so again, their message is quite optimistic. The technologies exist. There are barriers to adoption, in many cases cost, in some cases community involvement. We're involved in a large project in Bakersfield where we're trying to help, so Bakersfield is an oil and gas community. Those oil fields are not producing the way they once did. That infrastructure is great, has great potential for being a site for carbon storage. So how can we help the community understand these technologies, trust that these will be good for them, work with us to transition their economy from an oil and gas-based economy to a carbon management-based economy, work with local higher education institutes to help build their research capacity to support this transition. When we went to Bakersfield and talked about carbon capture, the reaction from people in the community was really hostile. They've heard many things from industry before. They just do not trust it. So the need for us to get out in communities and educate people about what these technologies are and are not and how they can be utilized is critically important. And then if we manage to decarbonize Bakersfield, how does that translate into a whole of country, whole of world effort to really begin to manage the amount of carbon we put into the environment as we continue to work to reduce emissions? So it's really important work. As I said, I'm very optimistic now because the team was so positive about today's capabilities. So if we can work on the economics and find ways to make these things scale, we have a possibility. Now, I mentioned scaling several times. We talked about this a little bit this morning. Smart strategies for utilizing existing supply chain, existing technologies, existing infrastructure are one way to ensure you can scale technologies quickly and economically. We're looking at trying to really understand the science of scale-up. So what does it take for any given technology to go from a bench scale prototype to an industrial scale demonstration? And there are smarter ways to go through that cycle than the traditional handoff system that we have, where we develop a bench scale technology, we might take it to an intermediate scale, we might then license it to a company who would seek funding and try to scale it up to the next level. Can we create smart strategies that allow us to both predict and then demonstrate that we can move very rapidly from the lab scale prototype to something that could go out into an industrial scale application? So we have done some small scale pilots looking at things like microreactors and how to create strategies to scale them very rapidly. So that could be as simple as, in one case, we came up with a new structure for the fiber bundles that are used in many direct air capture systems that could make them 30% more efficient. So that's a big deal if you want things to be economic. Well, it turns out it was a very complicated structure, and we additively manufactured it because it was this big. But if you needed to be this big, that didn't work. So the team came up with a very interesting way to essentially create sheets that could be easily manufactured and then assembled into this very complex superstructure. So, looking at using computing, design optimization techniques, AI and machine learning, are there ways to take emerging technologies, not just extant technologies, and put them on this scaling path very rapidly? We talked a little bit this morning about biology and the opportunity that biology presents as a machine. So we, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks about the lab, we have a big program in understanding human biology. How do we make humans more resilient? to biology. How do we develop drugs and therapeutics much more quickly by using modeling and simulation tools? Well, we also have teams that are working on understanding how to use biology in other useful ways. And so that could be everything from using biology to make chemicals that are needed, so building more environmentally friendly ways to make important chemicals that don't have some of the downsides of our current processes. How to use them to do things like recover rare earth elements. A lot of very valuable stuff goes into waste streams because we don't know how to economically recover it. So can we use biology as an engine to produce, mine the rare earths that we're now not recovering in a very cost-effective way? And then again, using microbes to enhance the uptake of carbon in the soil. The soil is a great place to sequester carbon. A tremendous amount of carbon is sequestered in the ground already. How do we make that system more efficient? And how do we take it to the next level? Again, through using the tools of science that we have in our hands, can we make these systems work? Now, what could go wrong? I don't know. But the law of unintended consequences suggests that something might. So our ability to really understand the impacts of these technologies in an ecosystem, not just for the local effect, but the bigger consideration, has to be an important part of how we do all these processes. If I listen to the discussions about genetically modified organisms around the world, there have been many cases where we sort of lost the conversation too early, where people didn't really understand or weigh the benefits versus the risks in a meaningful way. And we don't want to miss opportunities as we roll these new technologies out. So that's critically important. We also don't want to create an unintended ecological disaster, which would, for many reasons would be a bad thing. But, we have a series of acute problems that we're hopeful this line of research will help us address. So the picture at the right is not my office. That is Livermore. That's a Lego city that we have built, our critical infrastructure protection team built, that has an operating electric grid. And we use it to teach interns about cybersecurity. So every summer we run a big summer institute. We have dozens of students come. They learn about cyber protections for critical infrastructure systems, and they run a challenge. Last year's challenge was to take down the grid in Livermore in such a way. There was a cage in the middle of town that had Thanos' gauntlet in it. I'm not sure that was real, but in any case, the students learned about the tools and techniques of attacking critical infrastructure systems and protecting them, and then how to bring them back online. The picture at left is what we call Skyfall. So Skyfall is a cyber-physical test range. So with our big computers, we can do things like model the entire US grid. And then in the Skyfall lab, we can put real hardware from electric utilities in line with that model and understand in a very realistic environment what attack vectors might look like, how adversaries might pursue disablement of that equipment. Many pieces of equipment in our critical infrastructure systems weren't built with cybersecurity in mind. Many of them are old. They were built before cybersecurity was a consideration, really. And so this is a way to teach us how to be more resilient and how to build strategies to make these systems able to take care of themselves. So we talked about proliferation of rooftop solar. One example that we've worked on is using concepts from collaborative autonomy to make neighborhoods of rooftop solar resilient against cyber attack. So normally you'd have a master controller and a bunch of local controllers for each solar system. If the individual solar systems talk to each other and collaborate in how the system operates, then an adversary would have to take out many more of them to achieve an effect. Whereas with a master controller, it's relatively straightforward to take down the system. So this is a great way for us to think about how we get ahead of the challenges that our current critical infrastructure poses for the next generation of infrastructure that we're building today, and then how to retrofit the existing infrastructure, which represents massive investment, particularly at utility scale, and using tools like Big Compute and Skyfall and like generative AI and other tools to build these smart systems, how can we really change that calculus? You know, from a national security standpoint, the Department of Defense is very worried about critical infrastructure systems, because if you're sitting on a military base, it's connected to something. They don't have their own power generating plant, right? So, you know, just as Ukraine was connected to Russia, and Germany was connected to Russia through a gas pipeline, these critical infrastructure systems play a critical role in many things. So making them resilient is an incredibly important problem. So I warned my nuclear experts, who are right here, that I would have one slide on nuclear. We talked a little bit earlier today. Fusion is very exciting and great, and not today technology. So we can't deploy fusion energy at scale yet. What do we have today that we could deploy at scale that provides base load, stable power, known technology, very safe, and able to meet our expanding energy needs? Nuclear really fits the bill. But it's been incredibly difficult to build new nuclear plants in the US, not so much because of the technology, but because of all of the regulatory environment and complexity of building nuclear facilities. So the infrastructure required to house a nuclear reactor is very complex, and it's a very rules-based environment that you have to work within. So that means costs have been astronomical. Factors of 2 or 3 are not uncommon in large, 2 or 3 over original projections are not uncommon in nuclear projects. Actually, they're more common than not. We've just delivered 2 new nuclear reactors in the US. Cost ranges, the number I heard was $26 billion to build those 2. So your numbers may vary. There are a lot of things that drive those costs. They were very late. It's very good that they were built and brought online, but they took a very long time to build, and they cost an enormous amount of money. So for more than a decade, we've been working to develop, many companies have been working to develop small modular reactors with the idea that this is a way to mitigate the large upfront capital cost of building a large-scale nuclear plant. But we've not been able to get to the point where they're economically able to be deployed. So the one company that had a licensed small modular reactor, NuScale, never actually sited one due to significant explosion of the costs. So the nuclear renaissance that we've been waiting for, at least I've been waiting for 15 years, is possible. The technology exists, it's well understood, it's very safe. Small modular reactors present some advantages, factory built, some elements of more proliferation-resistant technology built into them. How do we move from this idea to deployment at scale? I thought it was interesting that when the AI companies started buying all the NVIDIA chips in the universe, they want to build big server farms, they started talking to the nuclear power industry. Like, can you build us a reactor really quick? Unfortunately, the answer is no. I cannot. But it is something that we could take on as a challenge. As I said, I'm not sure it's a technology challenge. There's a whole host of environmental challenges, if you will, that could be solved with political will and public acceptance, that could be a very important part of the ecosystem for the next 20 to 50 years when fusion will take over and everything will be great. Someone asked me how long I think it will take to deploy fusion energy. And I said 20 to 40 years. And I said 20 to 40 years because, roughly speaking, for fusion, time is money. So more money, the technology could be available sooner. The level of investment we have now, it's more than 40 years. So just a last comment on the what's happening in the government that's trying to really speed the pace of innovation. So with the emergence of large language models and ChatGPT, folks in the Congress got very excited about AI and really were very motivated to do something about it. We had a delegation of staff from 4 Senate offices come and visit us 18 months ago now. Senator Schumer, Senator Rounds, Senator Young, Senator Heinrich, people who can actually make things happen in the government. They really wanted to move out on a major appropriation to get the national lab system activated around AI. The president did release an executive order on AI that initiated a bunch of activities across the government, including a safety institute that's being stood up by the Department of Commerce, and a red teaming effort that Department of Energy is leading, which is really looking at how people could be using AI models to do things we don't want them to do. So understanding the boundaries of possibility with current models. But this FAST initiative, Frontiers in AI for Science, Security, and Technology, which is our effort to harness the power of the DOE labs, is still not funded. So while I have many internal projects supporting AI research and new applications of AI, we've not achieved the kind of funding at scale that's really going to be needed to move this technology to the forefront in the public sector part of this, which I think is really important. We have long-standing partnerships with most of the companies working in this space because we've worked hand in hand with them in high-performance computing for many years. So I think this is really important. You know, there's enormous potential here. There's enormous benefit to be had, economic, national security, you know, social, huge benefits. There are potential downsides, although I've learned that all the movies, all the AI doomsday movies are old. So when I make jokes at the lab, no one knows what I'm talking about. Skynet, come on. You know, it is important to think about guardrails and guidelines. How do we want to use these models? How do we as a country feel about how this technology will be deployed? And where do we think it's important to establish limits? Not regulations, not slow down the pace of progress, but think through what the potential second and third order effects might be from deployment of technologies like this at scale. So how do we harness all that potential without creating problems in the wake of it? And I'll just note, you know, in the wake of the gene editing revolution and CRISPR and Cas9, that community came together to really try to understand the ethics of those tools, because they're incredibly powerful. They will enable new cures and wonderful things to happen, and they can be used for terrible things. So how do we create a consensus around what the purpose is and where the boundaries lie? So with that, I'm going to leave you with this set of questions, and I'm happy to talk about any of them or answer questions on any topic you're interested in. So thank you for your attention. I should say this is like the most intimidating audience in America, so my palms are sweating. Sure.
So I have a question. You were talking about how it's very difficult to gain the trust of communities on these new technologies.
Yep.
And I think a lot has to do with the fact that many industries in the US, especially in the past 50 years, have essentially delivered broken promises to the places they have established in.
Yep.
So from a policy standpoint, like when you do these private-public collaborations on these new technologies, it is important that the trust should not be broken. And even like if you work so hard to gain the trust, you should not try to break it. So how do you ensure, you know, companies within our current policy framework behave well within the community such that, you know, workers and the people believe that it is okay, or that they're benefiting from such investment, because otherwise it'll just be another cycle of broken promises?
Yes, that's a really hard question. So one thing I think is really important, and I feel this acutely every day, you all pay for our work. We are stewards of the taxpayer dollar. We have an obligation to be honest arbiters of the technology. So we need to be out in those communities much more actively, talking to people about facts. You know, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, and helping to separate the big promises that are hype for the big promises that are really the future. So just as an example, for the last year, I've given a huge number of talks on fusion and fusion energy, and that's half trying to be enthusiastic because it's really amazing if we make this work, and half managing people's expectations. Because if we overhype this, if we overplay it, we'll lose the opportunity to do the thing we know is really good. So that's one. Second is education. So our lab foundation actually worked with educators in the Bakersfield area as an example to create a carbon management toolkit that teachers could use in the classroom. So you could start with younger kids and introduce them to concepts like managing carbon in the environment and some of the tools and technologies that go along with that. So you have a populace that's a little bit better able to understand when you come along with a new big idea. And those kids can go and talk to their parents about what the implications of this are. And then I really do think working hand in glove with key industry players is a critical part of that. We should pick our partners carefully and work with them to make sure that we deliver on the things that we promise. So
my main question is, you talk about how to build the trust, but I guess mine was mainly focusing on how to maintain that trust. How do we stop companies from, say, offshoring what they've been doing?
I don't think you can do it.
Like that?
I mean, the government can only do a few things. It can incentivize, it can regulate, it can use its purchasing power to try to move the market in particular directions. But in general, there will always be players in any industry that are not optimizing for the public good. I mean, I just think that's a problem. And I think this community engagement problem there's no one and done solution to it. It really is getting into communities and talking to people and building relationships over time so that they understand what trusted sources of information are. This is another big fear for generative AI. It gives you very ready answers to questions. Some of them are super wrong, just like full stop. Some of them are amazing, and some things it can do are very powerful, but we don't have a public that's really well positioned to differentiate fact from fiction in many cases. So the scientific community really needs to step up. It's our job to go out and be the interpreters and help people understand on an ongoing basis what the implications of emerging technologies are and where they should place their trust and where they should ask questions, and then support them in that process. And that really is something the government should feel accountable to the American public for doing, I think. Don't tell my boss I said that, but that's what I think.
Yeah. So first, as a fusion scientist, I think that was an excellently even-handed way of discussing fusion. Thank you. Maybe it comes from practice. So my question is about fission, right? So let's build 500 fission plants. Let's decarbonize the grid.
Yep.
When we talk about microreactors versus SMRs versus full gigawatt scale fission reactors, the proliferation risk is very different when you examine these technologies, and the proliferation risk also has a tremendous uncertainty when we talk about microreactors that don't have an on-site operator necessarily. So where do you, in your opinion, where is the trade-off between microreactors we can stamp out in a factory with TRISO or some advanced fuel that we plop in a neighborhood and can run the entire neighborhood versus SMRs that might run, a locality versus gigawatt scale plants? And just how should we advocate for nuclear? This is also a community-oriented question. What's the easiest way to advocate for community buy-in for these things? At what scale?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think there's two different ways to think about it. There's a practical argument about what really is possible given where we are today. And that takes account of this whole regulatory environment and licensing and what technologies people actually have deployed or know how to deploy with relative ease. I mean, there's nothing like easy in nuclear. So that puts you at large scale, gigawatt scale light water reactors, because we know how to do that. We have them. There's some existence proof that path forward is plausible. On the proliferation question, the advantage you have with advanced technologies or new approaches like small modular reactors is to think through how you want to build in proliferation controls from the beginning and engineer in strategies that allow you to really control the fuel, right? I mean, that's the risk. I was talking to someone earlier and just noted, if you look at the list of countries that want to acquire nuclear reactors and nuclear technology, and the list of countries you don't want to acquire nuclear reactors and nuclear technology, it's roughly the same, 1-to-1. And the US really doesn't have a vibrant domestic nuclear industry, so we don't even really have standing to drive what's going to happen around the world in this area. So that's one, is that the US needs to be involved because we're such a big player and we're such a dominant force in national security. We need to be a participant in this industry so that we can help drive standards and safeguards and think about proliferation risk. And then I think we need to do some experiments domestically in controlled environments where we can decide how well these strategies we've developed actually work in practice. So you could imagine if you wanted to deploy small modular reactors, the government could buy a whole bunch of them and put them on DoD and DOE sites. You already have the infrastructure and the expertise to manage them. You could begin to operate them and understand, are there things we haven't thought through? How realistic is it, this idea of build it in a factory, drop it on a pad, return the fuel when you're done? We could think about having a realistic strategy for how to disposition nuclear waste when this is all over, and begin to do some larger scale pilots on that front. Again, to build confidence that if we did build 500 reactors, we wouldn't just be creating a next problem for the next 40 years. So I would think about it I'm an experimentalist, in case that didn't shine through. I would think about it in doing some pilots and some experiments to really understand, do the assumptions we've made about microreactors or small modular reactors really hold when you test them against the real world? Do they operate as efficiently and safely and effectively with minimal controls? Can we understand, if you deployed a microreactor, can we actually understand whether or not someone's trying to divert that material or that reactor for other purposes? And there are, many technology solutions for some of those problems, but we've just not taken them out in the real world and tested them. So. Okay. Well, he's an expert, so he should tell you what the real answer is.
So oftentimes when we talk about energy technologies, we're always looking at how to get to lower costs, right? We want things to be cheaper. You mentioned Vogel, $26 billion. We always want it to be lower cost. And then after we say that, we toss on we want it to be resilient, and we want it to be safe, and we want it to be redundant. And we start adding all of these other engineering requirements which do nothing more than add cost.
Yeah.
And then we look back and go, what? Can these move fast now? How do we reconcile the national security need as well as the energy need and say, okay, how do we find the common ground?
Personally, I think we've lost the beat on risk as a people, not even as a country, just as a people. Modern nuclear reactors are very safe. We understand how to operate them safely. I mean, this is not that, they should be safe. I think that if I had to choose, should it be cheap or safe, it should be safe. That's fine. But we drive the cost in ridiculous ways by trying to drive the risk to absolute zero in most of these systems. So that's a huge part of the economic drivers in that system. We talked a little bit earlier about incentives in the system. We need incentives to marry safe and fast together and identify critical ways to streamline these processes so that it doesn't take essentially infinity to get a new technology licensed. In some sense, this idea of doing some controlled experiments where you actually deployed technology before you're ready to sell it, deploying it in a controlled environment at enough scale that you could really see, does it work the way we think it works? I think that would be helpful as well. And we struggle with this. So we call ourselves the Big Ideas Lab. I think we've had some really big ideas. But we struggle with this. The idea that, the way you do big things is you take chances, and the way you do, cutting edge science and technology is you fail, often. That's the learning cycle. You're going to ask questions you don't know the answer to. And in certain areas, we've lost the ability to do that. And this just seems like the poster child for unable to manage the risk relative to the huge benefit. So I would gladly have you put a nuclear reactor in my backyard. So if you got one. It's in California. It might be a little tricky.
Some academics are reporting really significant reductions in time to solution using self-driving labs.
Yeah.
So the idea is that they've got automation not only of the synthesis and the characterization, but then some sort of active learning to figure out what experiment to do next.
Yep.
Are you seeing that at Lawrence Livermore? Do you think this is important enough so that the country should be investing more? And to what extent is the sort of DOE leadership aware of this potential for advances in autonomous experimentation?
The last one's hard to answer. The first one, yes, absolutely. In many areas, I mentioned the work we're doing in designing proteins, antibodies, and small molecules to rapidly develop therapeutics. You know, we can model tens of thousands of candidate molecules in the computer and distill that down to 20, 30, 40, 100 candidate molecules. And then the trick is how fast can you screen them to provide data to train your models to make them better, to design the next loop. So we have built at least partially automated lab to do that kind of high throughput screening for biomolecules. We're looking at it in other areas where there are additional salutary benefits, like design of new energetic materials and explosives. Again, where you can synthesize molecules in very small quantities, very safe process, and then do automated screening for large numbers. What DOE has done in the last 20 years is build a bunch of experimental facilities that have extraordinary capabilities to generate data at high repetition rates, like the LINET coherent light source at SLAC. So it's a free X-ray free electron laser, works at high repetition rate. So we're starting to deploy these more automated technologies there because you simply can't make decisions fast enough to know what the next experiment should be. So if you want to even begin to take advantage of the capabilities that we're building, you have to begin to build automation into your experimental cycle. So in the fusion program, while the experimental cycle is not high rep rate, the vast amounts of data we generate on the big experiments and the many small experiments we do are beginning to build that kind of learning loop into our system. So we're very eager to move into more automated systems and self-driving labs, really understand the possibilities there, and particular for some of these very high-value user facility environments, deploy that because it's really the only way we'll take best advantage of them. For big DOE, I think we could get people very excited about the possibilities of learning in the loop. We just did an AI expo in Washington, D.C., where the 17 labs all presented, and we actually had a little demo that was a demo of a self-driving lab thing. The problem is that the external constraints on the department are very unreasonable in the current environment. So although everyone thinks, on a bipartisan basis, thinks science is incredibly important, the budgets for the Office of Science, for example, are not going up. So you have all these big facilities, they take up a significant part of the budget, that's a mortgage. So when you want to do something new or different on top of that, it's been very difficult. So a lot of the work we're doing is funded on internal dollars, developing small scale systems. So I think everyone gets it. Write to your congressman, tell them how important it is. Because it is speed. You know, we have this idea that somehow we're just smarter. So we'll always have the best idea first and we'll always win the race. But it's not true, right? Just the numbers say it's probably not true at any given moment that we have the smartest person on any given topic if you think about worldwide populations. So we have to be much more in that hungry mindset of moving quicker, innovating faster, driving those good ideas at a pace that we haven't done, we have not been as focused on in recent years. So, sorry, that turned into a speech. I didn't mean that, but self-driving labs are the future.
Hello? Hello. Yes. We're here.
Hello.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm a mathematician, so I look at things from the game theory perspective. I'm actually very interested in the geopolitical angle related to what you were saying just now. Because in some sense, with this huge spike in demand that's coming from the generative AI, in some sense, whoever's generating a lot of this energy is going to translate into a lot of resources, especially because you can instantly export the energy if it's being used for generative AI compute. It doesn't matter what country in the world it's located in. So what got me interested is, you mentioned that all these AI companies and tech companies came to you guys saying, can you build some nuclear reactors fast? And the answer that we said was, well, maybe not that fast. Do you happen to have any estimate or guess of whether there are other countries in the world where they surely also went to those countries? Are there other countries in the world where the answer was, just give me N years? And then go ahead. I'm just actually curious, what's the relative landscape for this all around the world? Because that translates into money in some sense.
Yep. Well, if you look at the commitments that some of the sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East are making to AI, it far outstrips what the U.S. is doing. Tens of billions of dollars, because they have resources. What they don't have is all the intellectual capital. But with that much money, you can attract the intellectual capital. And you might be able to build a nuclear reactor. And you might be able to, or maybe you can build the world's biggest solar farm in an area where there's plenty of sun to keep it going. So it is a significant consideration. We have an edge today. Even if you look, I saw an interesting talk looking at AI publications and patents in the US and China. And so from one dimension, you can look at it and say, well, there's sort of parity. If you look at the critical patents and publications in AI, the US is definitely leading. But we've seen it in other fields. That changes with time, right? There's a very large number of very smart people working very hard on both sides to maintain that edge. So if China's willing to invest more and build out the infrastructure more quickly, we could lose that. We could lose that edge. That's one reason why we're pushing so hard on this DOE initiative. The action in big, large language models is in the private sector. That's fine. But scientific applications, connection to these large-scale user facilities, applications in the national security space, they're not going to be, well, I hope not, they're not going to be done at DeepMind or OpenAI. So, how do we get the government system to move at the pace that the science is moving at? So I think the answer to your question is really, there are real opportunities around the world for others to jump in with both feet and either move talent to their money or use their money to close the gap with us. And as a country, we should, leadership matters. Leadership in science matters. And this has been a huge pillar of US security and leadership in the world for many decades. And for the last 20 years, we've sort of willingly ceded leadership in many fields. I don't understand it. So this is one where we should not. We should stand and fight, and we should push as hard as we can for the private sector to be incentivized to run, and for the public sector to lean as far forward on the things that we're responsible for as we can. So that's what I would do. Thank you. If anyone has a big check, that'd be great too.
Not billions. Thank you for your insights. Everybody's kind of interested in nuclear, so I feel compelled to chime in.
Okay.
A couple comments.
Sure.
UAE has built 7 gigawatt scale reactors at Baraka. It wasn't the United States that built it, it was Koreans, KHNP.
Yep.
Second comment, to your point about demonstrating small modular reactors, there is a NRC permitted build at Oak Ridge, the Hermes primary system for a molten salt cooled reactor, and there's also one for TerraPower's sodium cooled fast spectrum reactor that'll go at INO. So it is moving, perhaps too slowly, but it does seem to move. I have a question.
I did see Bill Gates with his shovel.
Did you? Well, I actually just saw the picture of a backhoe at Oak Ridge that just broke ground for the Hermes reactor.
That's great. That's great.
I have a question that actually impacts the development of the small modular reactor industry and is implicated in your comments about national security, and that is that it's commonly thought in the industry that in order to have efficient fuel use in water-cooled small modular reactors, which tend to have the zirconium rod assembly fuel, only shorter, you're going to need fuel reprocessing. The short reason is that because they're squatty, you have influence and effects, so you don't use the fuel as efficiently, you can't throw away that fuel, especially if you have a lot of these reactors. However, in the United States, per, I believe it's a Jimmy Carter executive order, we are not allowed to work on fuel reprocessing. So is there something that can be done in either a simulation way, or I probably can't talk about what may be done experimentally, but is there a way to do this in the US that meets the security concern?
So I think I think many things. We'll just put that as a disclaimer on what I'm going to say. I think decisions like that could be revisited in light of the world situation. I mean, to my point earlier about the US being a significant player in this industry, if the fuels were being returned to the US and reprocessed under secure conditions here where we could control the process from beginning to end, that might be a reasonable compromise to make. Where we get stuck, it's a good thing that the US wants to be an example to the world. And it's a good thing that we want to lead with our values and encourage others to do the right thing. The reality is that in most cases, others are not doing the right thing. So it's another reason to look at some of these decisions and barriers and say, in light of today's world situation, is it safer to lean in on this pathway domestically than to allow the industry to proceed around the world where we have no control or influence over it? Because the system of international norms and rules has been violated in ways that I can't even begin to imagine. I wrote emails to the lab. I wrote one about change, and I talked about all the things that I've seen since I came to the laboratory that have happened geopolitically. So I came in 1987, right? Still the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall hadn't fallen. We were still nuclear testing. You just go down this list of what happened over the last 30 years. There was a significant period where peace was breaking out and global security and stability looked assured. Russia was our friend. China was not a threat. It changed very dramatically. And the actions that Russia's taken to really undermine the rules-based order in an era of disinformation and political chaos is really problematic. So I would say we should talk about what the right thing to do is. Not what we decided 40 years ago or 50 years ago, but in light of today's geopolitical situation, what would be the best contribution we could make to global security and stability in some of these areas? And maybe it's different. So, all right. I don't know where we're at. You must be tired of me by now.
Definitely not tired of you. Oh, we got one more question.
Last question. We'll give.
So, question. So you said
or two more questions.
You shouldn't think about fusion for 20 to 40 years or something like that.
Yeah. I also said time is money.
But then we've heard here, even in the Hertz Foundation, some people affiliated with it are affiliated with companies that are doing fusion that are suggesting things are much, much sooner.
Yes.
For example, up in the Seattle area and such.
Yep.
How do we understand that? Because we don't have the level of knowledge you have. How do we piece together your view and these other things we're hearing?
So there are a wide range of approaches and a wide range of levels of credibility in the companies that are pursuing fusion. Just like any startup ecosystem, some of the ideas are more mature than others. Some might defy the laws of physics. I can't derive that for you right now, but there are a couple. So what you hope happens is what happens in every industry like this is those companies fail at a reasonably quick pace so that capital can be consolidated around some of the ideas that are more plausible. So that's the first thing. There are companies that are looking at a 10 to 20-year timescale, like 10 years for a demonstration scale project, 20 years for commercially viable power. That seems plausible with the right level of investment and focus. So for me, if we were going to be serious, we're going to go all in, we're going to deploy fusion energy at scale, it would not be unreasonable to say we want a $1 billion government program to look at materials, tritium fuel cycle, a few of these key technology questions that really need the big facilities at the labs for 10 years. Because I think first of all, if we had that money, the best people in the field would be lining up to solve those problems. Many of you have students who are amazing, who would give anything to be let loose on some of these problems. And we have a track record of solving problems like that when there's a driving time scale and there are resources to do it. So I use the example of NIF because we built that. It took us 15 years to build the laser. In the end, it cost about $3.5 billion. But when we got the authority to proceed with the project, 7 of the core technologies required to make the laser work didn't exist. Can you imagine that being green-lighted today? Right? But those problems were all solved in a robust manner, so that you could not only turn the laser on, you could operate it for 15 years and ultimately get to ignition. So that's one piece of it. I really hope that some of the companies that are making bold promises about the 10-year timescale are right, because that would be amazing, right? To have a proof of concept at that scale in a decade would be an extraordinary accomplishment. I've just watched how hard it was for us with 60 years of R&D and a very clear understanding of the physics to get everything to come together in a way that allowed us to get that first building block. I think there will be more challenges. And in plasma physics, for anyone who's not in plasma physics, every time you go to the next scale, whatever the next scale is, something emerges that wasn't predicted because they're complicated. So that's what, I want to be very enthusiastic. I want to make sure we don't get out so far over our skis, which the fusion community has done many times before, for the record, and not, take this seriously enough to actually solve those problems. So that's why my job is to be Debbie Downer and say, there's still work to be done, but we should do it. It's definitely worth doing. So, and you notice I didn't name anyone who's defying the laws of physics. You can make your own judgments, your own investments. It's all good. So was there one question in the back?
I didn't see one, but please.
There is one. Sorry.
Thank you so much. This has been extremely insightful. My name is Liam. I'm an in-school fellow. And I have a question about sort of like emerging technologies and national security in general. So we talked a bit about fusion and a couple of technologies where the sort of barrier of entry is very high. And there's this sort of game theory thing with nuclear weapons where it's this sort of mutually assured destruction type of game. And recently I've been thinking a lot about technologies where the barriers of entry are much lower and the mutually assured destruction strategy or equation isn't as clear, especially for non-state actors. So I'm a biotechnologist, but I think the same goes for a lot of AI systems. I'm wondering what is sort of like the national stance from Lawrence Livermore, National Labs, and also in general about how do we even approach these questions, because if we keep lowering the barriers to doing biotechnology or like making all these viruses, then ultimately we're going to get adversaries or non-state actors also doing that. Like it's really not that hard. So I'm wondering what are sort of your thoughts or general insights about this?
Yep. No, that's a very great question. Actually, the interesting thing over the last 2 decades maybe, is the realms that used to be wholly owned by large governments that have been opened to the mass market. So space is the other one, right? There was a time when you needed to be a large state-run program to be able to do space launch, and then we lost the ability to do space launch. I mean, it's quite amazing. And now if you go to Kennedy Space Center, every launch pad is branded because it's all commercial, which I would, in a million years, would never have predicted. So barriers to entry are very low, even for things that were, technically complex in the past. Space is a good example because we're critically dependent on space. Can you imagine what your life would be like without GPS? I mean, we wouldn't last 4 seconds. So, there's a huge range of, and our adversaries know that. They understand how we operate. They understand the kinds of technologies we deploy. They understand things we do. So there are attack vectors that are available that weren't before. Biotechnology is a great one. You don't need a big nuclear processing plant and access to large stocks of uranium to do something really nefarious with bio. I guess for me, the interesting thing about bio, though, is that the same things you need to do for naturally occurring disease also work in the biothreat space. So that's why we're leaning so far forward on bioresilience. Like, if we could develop vaccines and therapeutics in days to weeks, you wouldn't have to worry. Because as soon as there was some sort of emergent threat, you'd be able to respond in kind. So, it's very worrying. We haven't seen a large-scale bio attack, which is a little surprising given how fast the technology has changed. It turns out it's actually harder to weaponize bioagents than just to make bad stuff in your house. But we haven't really grappled with what that means for our traditional approach to national security. I pick on other agencies of the government, so the Department of Defense, their big focus is on integrated deterrence. So if you look at the way conflict plays out today, it starts with cyber skirmishes, and there might be gray zone combat, and there's all these new weapon systems and space and cyber and all these things coming together. And so integrated deterrence is how to use all the instruments of government to achieve your objectives, to either deter conflict or fight and win should you find yourself in a conflict. Well, the Department of Defense is exquisitely organized to not do integrated deterrence, right? It's organized around regional commands. What does a regional command mean for a cyber attack? Well, we have a cyber command. Okay, well, what if the cyber attack has a real world effect? Then who does that? And who's in charge? So if they attack the grid in the US, who's in the lead role there? So even our structures and the way we build our thinking around national security has to change in very fundamental ways. And there have been a whole series of reports. If you really want to know, there's a lot of stuff out there about the need for agility, the need for speed, for innovation, for new models, for breaking down bureaucratic and stovepipes and barriers, and finding new ways to take advantage of and deploy new technology. So that probably doesn't answer your question, but that does keep me awake at night. So anyway, thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Oh, and I get a treat. Thank you.